I always love doing the booking for the Weird Weekend because somebody said to me in the bar last night, I said, who are these people? Do you phone up their agents? I don't think anyone's got agents. If they have, I've got their numbers. These are all people either who've been my friends for years, or they've been people who I just happen to sort of run into in a bar somewhere. Or they're people I meet, like I met Ratty for the first time at a gig in 1978. Or they're people I've seen lecture, and I was at the... Janet, John, where are you? You in here? I was at the LAPIS conference. See, that's Janet and John who run LAPIS, Lancashire Aerial Phenomena Investigation Society conference, 3 years ago? I don't know, it was 2 years ago, it was just before Karina and I got married. And there was a bloke there who was absolutely bloody stunning, so I spent the last 2 years trying to get him to come down here. Admittedly, it was my fault. So I still smoked at that time. Oh, it's so good to be able to stand up and really, really smugly say I gave up smoking. But one of the disadvantages of having given up smoking, I no longer have a fag packet in my pocket all the time so I can write things on. But so I wrote his phone number on a fag packet in a bar. I drank some whiskey, I lost the fag packet, and totally lost touch with him until he turned up at the 14 Times On convention last year, and then we made sure we actually wrote it down somewhere more permanent. But you don't want to hear my introduction, you want to hear Richard's. Just give that one.
Alan Murdie is the author of such books as Fish Hooks of Africa and Their Distribution, European Spoons Before 1700, and Jaws and Teeth of the Ancient Hawaiians. He's here to talk about his new book, Prehistoric Sandals from Northeastern Arizona.
Thank you very much for those kind introductions. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for turning up. It wasn't completely true why this is the first time I've had the pleasure of coming to Weird Weekend. Previously, I've had an August fixture on behalf of an American touring company who rejoice in the name Tours of Terror, who once or twice a year come to the UK on a UK-wide ghost tour and go around haunted England, and they bring me along to help give an English flavour to the proceedings. And previously I've been tied up. They didn't come this year, which is probably a good thing, because the last tour I went on them was more like Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. One hospitalisation, one minor fracas, a near arrest, and a road traffic accident. And the worst incident was, I know lawyers are usually fairly unpopular, my day job is being a lawyer, but at the moment bankers are even more unpopular. Do you want me to tell you a bad banker story quickly? Well, it was how ghost hunters from America and bad bankers in the City of London didn't get on. Typically, being Americans, they wanted to do the Jack the Ripper tour and go on a tour around Whitechapel. And of course, Whitechapel today is nothing like it was 20 years ago, let alone in the Victorian era. Nonetheless, they had a Jack the Ripper tour and ended up in a Jack the Ripper linked pub, the 6 or 8 Bells. And there were 2 drunken city bank workers there. And they zeroed in on a quite mature lady, perhaps late 50s, early 60s, but very feminine, very nicely presented, very kind lady. And I don't know quite what happened, but one of them started claiming he was gay, so his friend ran away. And then this banker fellow pushed the lady into a corner and was belabouring her with endless amounts of stories about his exciting world in banking. And he was very drunk. And it came to the time for the party to depart. And I was sort of trying to round everyone up, and I went over and sort of say, "Caroline, time to go." "Caroline, oh, excuse me," and I was sort of doing my best sort of, "Excuse me, young fellow, can I just, bring this lady with the rest of her group now?" Unfortunately, there was a much bigger American fellow than me. Had none of this time for this pussyfooting around the issue, just strode forward, grabbed hold of the banker lad, holds him up like that in best John Wayne style and says, "Stop hitting on your mum!" And from that point, the place cleared from embarrassment. But Anyway, leaving aside the anchor stories, let me come on to the subject of my talk this afternoon. Now that the children have gone off to Bigfoot, I'm going to talk about a few experiences I've had, a few investigations I've conducted in some of the many issues and accounts of strange phenomena I've examined in a much maligned South American country, that is Colombia. Now, Colombia, for those of you who remember your geography, Colombia is the top of South America. It's the only South American country to have both a Caribbean and a Pacific coast, an Atlantic coast, and it's 4 times the size of the UK, and its population is about 38 million, and until overtaken by Iraq and 1 or 2 other places, regrettably it also had the highest murder rate in the world during the 1980s and 1990s. However, Colombian friends of mine insisted that, do give this talk today, they said, please, to show that there is another side of Colombia, because Colombians get well and truly fed up with really what is not even subtly disguised racism, which makes out every Colombian to be muddled up with drug dealing, trafficking, crime and violence. And the vast majority of the population in Colombia are like anywhere else in the world. They are lovely people and they live in an absolutely fascinating and wonderful country, despite all the many problems that have afflicted them over the last 40 years. This is the capital city. This is a view of Bogotá. It's quite a high capital city. It's 3,000 metres, so you suffer a bit from altitude sickness when you first arrive there, if you're not used to high altitudes. And it's home to some 6 million people. And I've visited Bogotá about a dozen times. I'm pleased to say that I've got a number of academic friends in Colombia. I certainly wouldn't want enemies in Colombia, but I have a number of friends in the universities here who've helped me with some of the investigations and studies that I've done. Well, let's get into some of the strange things, and I would certainly welcome from the expert gathering we have here today any insights you may have on some of the following. This is a view of the Colombian town of San Bernardo, about 60 miles south of Bogotá. It's in an area which is known in Colombia as the Red Zone. It is an area of guerrilla activity, and it's also an area the Foreign Office tells you not to visit if you're a UK national. Nonetheless, I decided in September 1997, September the 8th, to put this advice firmly to the back of my mind, to visit San Bernardo because of the existence of what had become known about 18 months earlier as an absolute national mystery, an absolute national wonder, which was receiving a lot of coverage in the Colombian media. In a story worthy of the pen of Stephen King, since 1959, the bodies of the dead in San Bernardo do not decay, but seem to be undergoing some kind of strange mummification process. Now, in 1959, they opened a new cemetery at San Bernardo, and the background to this is Colombian burial custom. Typically, if you are living in a town or in a city, if you're an urban dweller, the burial practice when you die in Colombia is that your remains are taken and you are put inside a catacomb. That is basically in a kind of box arrangement. There are walls of them, and they put your body in there, and your body is left in there, sealed up, for 6 years. At the end of 6 years, they open up the catacomb, remove your skeleton, your bones are broken and sawed down, and you are then put in an urn or an ossuary, and the catacomb is freed up for future members of your family who, in the natural course of things, pass on. And so the same grave space is used, and then the urns are typically deposited or kept at home or whatever. Well, that was the practice again at San Bernardo. But in 1966, they started opening the catacombs. And they found, to their dismay, that the bodies were not decaying. They had mummified. Now, this was successfully covered up in San Bernardo for the best part of 25 years. But by the early 1990s, they were having a serious storage problem because the bodies were not disintegrating. And so they were having to use all kinds of methods to dispose of them because they were continuing to remain in a kind of mummified state. So this mystery, as I said, started to give a lot of publicity, and in September 1997, accompanied by Dr. Martha Galliano, who's a forensic medicine specialist in Colombia, I went along to have a look for myself. Now, San Bernardo is a beautiful town, lies high up in the Andes, surrounded by absolutely stunning scenery. Some of the finest scenery I've seen in the world is the Colombian Andes. And accompanied by a local woman who owned a local house, who acted as our guide, we drove to San Bernardo. And we arrived in the square there. And it was full of people. And I could hear fireworks going off and a band. I thought, oh, there's a bit of a party going on. And we quickly asked for directions to the cemetery. It seemed the whole town was in some kind of state of rejoicing. And we then drove up to the cemetery. And then it was there, we actually then discovered that we had picked absolutely the wrong day to come to San Bernardo, because deployed outside the cemetery were 15 members of the Colombian army, all with guns and one heavy machine gun, and we had arrived on the day in which the Colombian army was taking part in a hostage exchange with the FARC guerrilla movement. And the fireworks going off in the town were actually the celebrations over the return of 3 kidnapped electoral candidates who were being handed back to San Bernardo, and there was this exchange of prisoners going on between the guerrillas and the army, and both sides were armed up for the occasion. And this is the thing, when you actually deal with, thankfully we don't have identity cards in this country, they have them in Colombia. Funnily enough, they've not stopped crime. They have had absolutely no impact on crime levels in Colombia, and in fact, people actually get murdered in order to obtain their identity cards. Not a good situation. Now, previously, when I've undergone checks from soldiers or police officers, you just answer the questions. And it's often quite a good idea when you're confronted with a policeman or a soldier who's checking your identity, ask him a question. As long as it's a polite question, a sensible question, like where can I park my car, or something like that, because you start to interact with the officer in a human way, and they relax if you're asking some typical harmless, neutral question. Well, the worrying thing was these soldiers just stared at me as I got out and sort of, hello, I'm from England, I'm here to see the mummified bodies of San Bernardo, please. Can we come in the cemetery? Well, anyway, they didn't give us any aggravation, they just stared at us. And we went up to the cemetery gates, where there was a lady standing by the gates, and they were locked, and we said, could we see the sacristan, please? Mr. Alfredo, whose name we picked up. And the reply came back, no you can't, he's drunk. Alfredo the sacristan was in town and had already, even though it was only sort of 1 in the afternoon, was thoroughly drunk. However, this being Colombia, they went and summoned his mum. And his mum had a set of keys, and she took us down to the chapel. Now, in the chapel, they had laid out 8 of the best specimens of the dead of San Bernardo. Now, the chapel rules said you could not take photographs. However, I managed to get this picture of one of the incumbents. He's a gentleman who was 65 years old when he died in 1987 of a heart attack. And there were 7 other bodies also on display, male and female. The youngest was someone in their 30s, the oldest was a lady of 80. All had been dead upwards of 10 to 12 years. The bodies had not decayed completely, they had either turned grey or they had turned brown. A number of them, they still had all kinds of features intact. Their hair was well preserved, nails and so forth. They were mummified bodies, and the people in the chapel said, we never touch them, this is how they come out of the grave after 6 years. We expect bones, and this is what we find. Well, it was interesting seeing the reaction of Dr. Galliano, who has worked in forensic medicine for years, and she said she had never seen anything like this before. There were also listed, almost like medical notes at the end of each display case, were the conditions from which the person had died. A number of them had wasting diseases or cancer, and she said in those sort of cases you'd have expected the deterioration of the body very quickly. This has not occurred. And it doesn't just afflict the adult dead. Upstairs they had another display case which is not immediately shown to visitors, but you can see there the bodies of children. It also affects babies and also cases of burials of stillbirths. It seems that whatever is happening, age and condition and cause of death does not prevent this weird phenomena. They've started calling it locally the disease that strikes after death. And as well as the display of the rather poignant display of the babies' bodies, they had them in shoes and so forth. There was also on display a whole cadaver of somebody who was listed as unknown. It was an anonymous body that had been found locally. Again, it had shown this preservation. They'd actually severed the body completely in half, and there was it was clear even from my non-medical examination that whatever this phenomena is, it had gone right through the body, that the internal organs were also mummified and preserved in some peculiar way. As Dr. Galliano said, I had never seen anything like this before. So we, after paying our respects in the chapel, we then left, and two things happened as we left the cemetery. First of all, there was a little Colombian lad of about 9-10 years old, came running up, "Senor, senor," pulls me over, leads me down to the edge of the chapel where there's a crack in the wall, and pointing down, he showed me where the rest of the inmates of the graveyard were. There was a crypt underneath the chapel, which they don't allow the public into, but you could see down in there, and there was just enough light, and it's an area, I should think, probably about the area of the size of this room. From what I could see, there was a ghoulish identity parade of bodies all standing upright against the wall, and more inside. They are actually stood up. There are so many of them. The only way they can pack them in is they're all standing upright. Also looking at them, I could also see, however, the state of deterioration of the bodies in a lot of cases appeared to be a lot worse than those I'd seen upstairs, but it was quite clear that this mummification process was quite widespread throughout the bodies that are initially interred at the cemetery. The second thing that happened just as we were leaving, and this was a real gothic horror touch, a thunderstorm broke out. Now, Andean thunderstorms are spectacular, and the lightning flashed, and the thunder rolled, and the rain came pouring down, which told us one thing. It isn't because of the particularly dry Andean air that there is some kind of mummification effect going on. There are lots of examples of indigenous mummies you can see in museums scattered around Colombia, where some kind of natural mummification process has occurred, but it seems to have been where they've been kept in dry tombs. Here, it was a damp climate. The Andes are not by any means bleak, bare mountains. There's jungle growing on a lot of the peaks, up to quite a high altitude. The infamous coca fields are all at about 8,000 feet. They need certain thermal floors on which for the crop to grow. And so there's no obvious explanation as to why this weird phenomenon should be taking place. It's not because the area is somehow excessively dry or arid. It's not, it's wet. It's not the soil or the ground, because for the first 6 years, the bodies are actually stored in catacombs in the air. Is it something in the construction of the cemetery? Well, again, this explanation doesn't work out. It's because they found in local fields, they found murder victims buried in fields, and the same phenomena has happened to people buried outside the cemetery. Someone suggested perhaps it was sand brought in locally, mixed into the concrete. That doesn't explain why has this phenomena only started in the last 50 years. The local explanation, when you talk to the locals, they chummily put it down to diet. They say it's because of the beans and the fruit they eat in the area. They gave me examples of the beans and the fruit. Well, I tried to check that one out as well. I took it to a dietitian at the National University of Colombia in Bogota, Dr. Sarah Russi-King. She checked these particular fruit and berries and said there is nothing special about these at all. They are not unique to San Bernardo, they are eaten throughout the country. And there's also the question of, even if it was the beans and the fruit, well, how does this explain the babies? The babies that died in infancy or were stillborn, they would never have consumed them. The only way possibly might have been through some kind of fetal nutrition, but that's not the way in which nutrition works, she says, for a fetus. So it can't be the berries or the fruit. So we're left really, and that's where it stands at the moment, there's yet to be an investigation. All kinds of folklore is growing up. A few years ago somebody stole one of the bodies, so they've upped the security, and they've even blamed wicked scientists in England for having stolen it. So if there are any wicked scientists in the audience who know anything about the disappearance of bodies at San Bernardo, this is your chance to come clean. But it does remain something of a mystery. I'd welcome any explanations. But one person who might, I thought, be worth asking, if I run into him again, is Dr. Mark Benekay, whom I had the pleasure of meeting at the World Dracula Convention in Sighisoara, Romania some years ago. Now, Dr. Mark Benekay is a German pathologist. He is the world's expert on what insects do to you when you are dead. And somebody has to do it, and he goes around the world visiting crime scenes and inspecting the insects which have eaten away at the bodies. And Dr. Benekay would make a perfect performer here at this weekend. When you actually meet him off the platform, he is a very sort of rather dithering young German man, speaks excellent English, short cropped hair, glasses, something of a nerd. Put him on the platform and he is transformed. Up on the screen will come a picture of a skull. It will look like to me like a skull dropped in pea soup. And he starts yelling at the audience, "What you are looking at is not causing you fear. It may disgust you, but you are not afraid." He gives the best Dr. Strangelove impersonation I have ever seen. On the platform, he is totally transformed. Off it, mild-mannered, bumbling man. Get him up with his disgusting slideshow, which I never want to see again, of bodies and insects and the interchange between them. I'll have to ask him what he thinks about this. I mean, he'll be off there on the next plane, doubtless. But it is something of a mystery, but it's not the only one. Because long before the Spanish and the Europeans got to Colombia, there were, of course, people living there for thousands of years. This is a photograph of one of the statues at San Agustin. San Agustin is a little-known site in the south of Colombia. Spread over an Andean valley for an area of about 150 square miles, 200 square miles, are literally hundreds of statues. Statues of sort of ancient shamanistic wizards. And they range in size from about the size of garden gnomes, which some of them do resemble, to statues up to 21 feet high. And quite often they appear to be part human, part animal, particularly jaguars. And this culture actually disappeared around 1500, as far as archaeologists, anthropologists can work out. They vanished completely. The before the Spanish even got there. The Spanish arrived and thought the statues were placed there by the devil, because the costumes of some of the shamans resembled those of Catholic priests of the time. And they thought this was a trick put by Satan on the mountains to deceive the Indian folk for when we arrived with the enlightenment of the Catholic religion. Now, I must say, the Catholic religion does do a lot of good in Colombia. For one thing, it is actually the voice of scepticism in the country. There is so much witchcraft, magic, occult, weird stuff going on. It's actually the Catholic Church. No Richard Wiseman figure is ever wheeled out on Colombian television. They bring a priest out to say, well, this is not the Virgin Mary which has appeared on a water tank. This is just a stain. The voice of scepticism is the Catholic Church. However, they were disturbed by these statues. But people, more open-minded anthropologists looking at them, have noticed, you'll notice the round eyes. Now, this is a characteristic of nearly all the statues. They all have round eyes, and the view of a Colombian anthropologist, Richel Dolmatov, who studied Colombia and its people and history from the 1930s through to his death in the 1980s, is that these represent shamans in trance. And one of the most amazing things about not only the Colombian indigenous tribes, but also the people right across the Amazon basin, a small part of the Amazon actually runs through the very south of Colombia. But throughout that region, an area of several thousand miles, is the immense detailed knowledge of the powers of plants. So detailed that in fact now Western pharmaceutical companies for the last 25 years have been sending expeditions to the Amazon, places like Colombia, to collect the herbal and indigenous knowledge of local people, which still survives and is held by the shamans. And there are still practicing shamans, witch doctors, conjurers, using this kind of medicinal knowledge. And they know all kinds of things which are not known to the best chemists from Switzerland, the United States, or Great Britain, or other parts of Europe. And one of the most common ones in Yahe is a drug called, one of the most common ones in Colombia is a drug called Yahe, which is made from jungle creepers and vines. It's known by the people as the vine of death, or the vine of the dead. Because when you ingest it, it takes a long, complicated process that takes about 12 hours of preparation. But it ends up with two plants. One of them suppresses your digestive juices. The other goes into your bloodstream through the stomach, then goes into your brain, and triggers the most astonishing hallucinations. Now, I emphasise, I have never attempted anything with this particular plant or drug, Yahe. For one reason, I think, is respect for an indigenous culture, that it is actually part of a whole spiritual and cosmological view. It was used for specific magical, religious and practical purposes, though I have met some Indians who talked about it and he said, well, we call it sometimes jungle television. After we had experience of films for the first time, we realised that the Yahe gives you such a vivid experience. It is like watching a film, so vivid are the experiences, visions that you have, but you're actually in the film taking part in it. Western botanists, other people who've tried it, have often described what is known in parapsychology as the out-of-body experience, kind of astral travel experience. And you go off into the Milky Way or into the spirit world, you go off into a different dimension. The Indians' view on this is actually that is a wrong analysis. They don't actually make a distinction between the spirit world and the three-dimensional physical world. As far as they're concerned, it is all one unity. But on the subject of the plants, it is a mystery how these people, without a written culture, without mathematics, have nonetheless managed to discover, without any scientific framework, mysteries, riddles, powers, curative properties of plants, herbs, which are unknown to Western science with all its forces. And they know what they can do, and they've got this amazing detailed knowledge. And we don't have that knowledge, they have. Now, one of the things when I've discussed this with people is they say, well, it's trial and error. Well, they are surrounded by 80,000 different known species. That's just the ones we know. It really is something of a phenomenon with no written culture to have gone through 80,000 trials and come up with this knowledge. I contacted a professor of history of medicine at Penn State University in the United States. I said, have you got any explanation of this herbal medicine? He said, well, when it comes to the herbal powers of plants and indigenous communities, we had no idea how they got this information. You talk to the Indians, you ask them, well, how do you discover this? They say, well, the plants talk to us. The plants talk to us either in the trance state or in dreams. That's how we know. One ends up thinking there is a big mystery here, which somebody may be able to solve, but ultimately, when we think about it, with our ideas of time and space, if we follow those through to where they ultimately get us in terms of philosophy and science, we can't explain it. We can't explain time or space ourselves. There's no one here, even though we use concepts of time and space, you used them when you came in to sit down today, to move around, to live our daily lives. We don't understand time or space. We can't conceive of infinity in space going on forever. We can't conceive of time going on forever. What happened before the Big Bang? We don't know the answers to time and space either. So we must not be presumptuous in trying to tell, I think, indigenous people that we've got the explanation for their experiences and for their visions when they've got things we clearly don't know and Western science can't find. There were also some very weird religions in the past. There seems to have been in Colombia a religion worshipping the penis. This is a phallic stone, one of many, in another part of Colombia called Villa de Leyva. Maybe it's what some of our Sarsen stones and prehistoric stones looked like in Britain 5,000 years ago before being cleaned up. They have their own equivalent of miniature stone circles, stone avenues, again similar to the ones we have in the British Isles and Western Europe. Research is only just beginning into possible astronomical alignments on these stone circles, but they seem to be tied up with knowledge of astronomy. Detailed observations were obviously taking place, even though in the absence, apparently, of a written culture. But let's get on to some other things. Ghosts. Colombia does splendidly for ghosts, splendidly for apparitions, all kinds of terrors. This is a version of El Mohan, also known by several other names. Look at those fearsome teeth. This apparition is said to haunt jungle tracks, lonely roads. You are particularly at risk of a fatal encounter with El Mohan if you are one of the following. You are a drunkard. You are a philanderer and adulterer, or a promiscuous person. You are a person who habitually walks about at night for no good purpose or reason. And fourthly, you're in danger as well of El Mohan if you are a Freemason. These are the categories that El Mohan goes for. Now, the interesting thing about ghosts in Colombia, which is an entirely different talk of its own, is that when you strip away the colourful folklore, the actual experiences people report are very similar to those that we report as ghost experiences in Britain. Even though words such as poltergeist don't exist in Spanish, they talk about duende, or elves, goblins, the type of phenomena, and I've tracked these into works going back into the 19th century, resemble our account of poltergeist phenomena. And the same with the actual ghost reports people are reporting in the country. They could be, when you actually take away all the colourful folklore and interpretations, they are very similar to the type of ghost that people report in haunted houses here in Britain. Some of the stories are a little far-fetched. Despite it being claimed in 2001 that a UFO buzzed the highest building in Bogota, this is the Colpatria building. It's owned by an insurance company. Life insurance is a big business in Colombia, so they've got the highest building. There were claims of 5,000 witnesses. I'm afraid I have not been able to find any. I did see in Cartagena on the coast a house which has been closed since 1908 on account of its ghosts and hauntings, and I have done a bit of ghost hunting in some old colonial houses in Cartagena, and that's a pretty spooky experience as well. And as I said, the poltergeist, there's a big seance movement in Colombia, spiritism, it's all going on, very little investigated. But these sort of things have been going on in the records when you start digging into archives for many, many years. There's me ghost hunting along the Caribbean coast, one of the best ghost hunts, going for a swim in the warm sea. This was on an area known as the Beach of the Dead. Sadly, it's become the Beach of the Dead in the 1980s. A lot of people, you probably remember there was a drugs peddler called Howard Marks a few years ago, did the circuit. Well, his criminal associates in Colombia killed dozens of people along the beach here. I met one man who had lost 11 members of his family, murdered by marijuana pushers in the 1980s. But aside from reciting their tragedies, they say this area is filled with glowing lights, strange balls of light about the size of basketballs which move down the estuary from the sea. They're seen in this region here, a place called Analima over the mountains. And one of the most fascinating stories I encountered, or re-investigated, was the case of a Colombian farmer killed in 1969, allegedly by a flying saucer. Well, to cut a long story short, after checking the news coverage, I originally found this in some UFO books published in Britain and England. Well, I've tracked it down to newspaper reports in Colombia, and found that Analima, which is about 40 miles outside Bogota, definitely existed. Found that the building mentioned in the story existed, as indeed the family. And I went into Analima and managed to trace one of the alleged witnesses. Except he told a completely contradictory story. He claimed he'd never been there, and then went on to give quite detailed accounts of what had not happened. He didn't really want to talk to me. I can quite understand the sense of you suddenly had somebody knocking on your door on a Saturday afternoon whilst you're watching the football, from battling on about someone from Colombia, say, knocks on your door and says, wants to talk to you about UFOs, your experiences years before. You might not want to necessarily immediately engage with them until you found out a bit more about them. Nonetheless, I followed the Analima story locally, talked to other local people, and was given a number of significant leads. Eventually, I managed to track down a member of the Bermudez family. The man who died was Arcesio Bermudez. He died in July 1969. The story was that a family party was taking place about 6 in the evening. Suddenly a large ball of light appeared outside the garden. They all went out to look at it. One of the children shone a torch at it. Arcesio Bermudez went after it when it moved away. He chased it over a hill. He came back very frightened. And he said he'd seen a little man inside the light. Shortly afterwards, he collapsed. He was taken to hospital 2 hours away in Bogota, but he died. And his death was attributed by his family to the UFO, to the object. Now, the local interpretation, when the story was published in the 14 Times, they did that. Because they know 14 Times sells if it has a flying saucer on the cover. It looks good. People buy the magazine. Whilst that is a very good picture of the landscape, what they actually saw was a glowing light. Not a disc or a saucer, but a light. Nonetheless, when I tracked down Mr. Bermudez's nephew, who is an architect in Bogota, he confirmed that indeed his uncle had died and that they had no proper explanation for his death. He also put me in touch with a hospital doctor who carried out an autopsy. The hospital doctor said the strange thing about Arcesio Bermudez's death was that we couldn't raise his body temperature. He'd suffered a collapse of body temperature, hypothermia, in July in the tropics, and they couldn't explain that. His body had then been buried, and this is where the extra twist comes in with the whole story is that, as with this burial custom I talked about, after 6 years they opened up the catacomb in Bogota Cemetery where Arcesio Bermudez had been laid to rest. His body was missing. Arcesio Bermudez, the man allegedly killed by a flying saucer, became the first person to be abducted after his death. Something of a ufological first. What is my take, having looked into the story, having followed the case up as best I could, having met, interviewed people, checked the sources? The strange thing is, with the exception of the one person who said he wasn't there and then had all the details, everything I was told locally tied up. After my first visit, one of the things I was told, for instance, was that excited American researchers had arrived 3 months after the death in July 1969. And they'd arrived there in September. They'd also seen UFOs. A group called NICAP, National Investigation Group for Aerial Phenomena or something like that, based in the United States, very influential. Well, the story in Colombia was that they had also seen objects around the farm where Mr. Bermudez died. Subsequently, on looking at NICAP's records on a visit to Roswell in November 2003, I discovered that yes, they claimed they had seen strange things. All the details on this particular case tie up, which is quite interesting. If I was trying to prove that Arcesio Bermudez had died in a road accident in 1969, I have got the same level of proof that would succeed were this to be subject to a civil court claim in Britain. It is a case I do not have any explanation. And finally, let me just, as I think it's rounding up time, I believe is approaching, let me just point you in the direction of my next little investigation. I'm going back to Colombia later this autumn, and this is again a story which I picked up some years ago, which I've not properly had a chance to collect other than a few press cuttings and documents. But it's the strange case of Colombia's own Roswell. Now, in February 1968, something fell out of the sky in the northeast of Colombia, in an area called Los Llanos. And it was immediately described as platillo volador, flying saucer. And lots of press and publicity in the Spanish-speaking press about it. It did feature very briefly in one or two ufological journals in English. That great organ of light and truth, Flying Saucer Review magazine, had something about it. But it remains something of a mystery. Clearly something fell out of the sky, and the trail that I have uncovered so far is that these remains, these chunks of metal, were then taken to the capital, Bogota, and they were then taken to the nuclear reactor in Bogota, which then functioned as part of a civil nuclear program. And there they were inspected by the North American air attaché, who came over from the United States, and that is where the trail goes cold. Some of the press coverage says this announces that after the American attaché got involved, that this was a spy satellite that came down in Colombia. Now, it does seem rather strange that the Americans would announce, our spy satellite has crashed. That does seem a bit strange. I'd have thought that is something you would not immediately announce. There have been other suggestions that it was part of a lunar probe, part of another satellite. There is clearly something that came down there worthy of investigation. Colombia's own crash retrieval case. Now, personally, I'm not convinced of metal flying saucers as much as I'd love to believe them. I've met several government ministers, and I am convinced of the existence of people who come from other planets. But I don't think they're necessarily up there in metal ships. But this is an intriguing one. The most intriguing detail of all the coverage, however, is a few throwaway lines in one of the newspaper reports where they talk to the local people about this thing falling out of the sky. And the interesting comment of one of the local Colombian witnesses back in 1968 is, yes, this sort of thing has been happening now here for about 18 months. strange objects coming out of the sky which they can't explain. So that is going to be the next thing I'm going to try and look into, Columbia's own Roswell. Well, you heard it here first. Anyway, what will become of it, I don't know. But thank you very much indeed for listening this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, guys. Well, we do have. Is this microphone? One. Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, we do have time for some questions. Can I have my runner, please? Silas.
Hello, it's fascinating. Apropos of your chap who died of hypothermia in the tropics. Oh dear. Hello.
That was me, sorry.
Are you familiar with the Longdendale Lights near Manchester?
No,
traditional.
I vaguely heard them, but no, I couldn't tell you anything.
It just struck a chord because apparently the local farmers are supposed to have known about these for generations, but they don't like talking about them. But what they say is that when these curious lights are called the Devil's Bonfires appear up on the heights of Longdendale, that thereafter sheep are found frozen to death, as though something had sucked the energy out of the atmosphere. I just wondered if there might be a connection.
Well, I have seen sort of anecdotal evidence of low body temperatures supposedly found in people in the United States who might have encountered a UFO being found dead, but some of those occurred in the middle of winter, so it might not be. That is a very interesting detail. I mean, particularly that also reminded me of the other story I heard locally in Annalima. The locals' interpretation, local villagers who lived there all their lives, didn't see it as a UFO. They saw it as a waka, or death light, basically a kind of omen, which had appeared to indicate that Mr. Bermudez was about to die. And then talking to one of the locals, he told another fascinating story. After the lights appeared, the village was then haunted, but it was haunted by mysterious rabbits. And we could never catch these creatures, and they would come out, they would confront us, but we could never kill them, we could never catch them. And they ran around, and we were terrorised by these rabbits. Now, I happened to mention this about 3 weeks after I came back to Britain at a folklore conference in Edinburgh. And at the end of, I talked about this, and one of the participants was a charming young archaeologist who said to me, well, do you know who the first person abducted by aliens was? And I said, oh, was it Betty and Barney Hill? And then I thought, no, perhaps it was that Brazilian farmer who supposedly had some exciting erotic encounter in 19 Boas, I think his name is, with an alien. But no, he said, no, the first person to have been abducted by aliens is Bugs Bunny. And in a 1953 cartoon, Bugs Bunny is abducted by the Martians. Well, subsequently, I made a mention of this in the 14 Times article. I then received a delightful document from a gentleman in the United States called Martin Kottmeyer, which was his thesis on the connection between rabbits and UFOs. And he says that rabbits are intimately connected with the UFO experience. And there was this long list of cases where some witness says, I felt like a scared rabbit, or I saw rabbits and then I saw the UFO, or the men were out hunting for rabbits when this happened, and so forth. And he's actually come up with a whole new subject called leap-foovology, the connection between UFOs and rabbits.
That sounds like a possible connection, the traditional connection between the hare and the moon. Bunny-like creature. Indeed,
yes. So the ramifications get more and more fascinating.
The other one about the perishing after encountering a UFO, there was I think it's quoted in one of Paul Deborah's book about Earthlights, but I think it's a Nepalese tradition. They see these globes of light on the hills, and they say it's the Chota Adamis, the little men, and you mustn't go near them because you will die soon afterwards. It sounds a little like, almost like radiation poisoning or something.
Well, I think it's the case with a great many indigenous cultures around the world. There is a tradition of strange lights flying about. Colombia, on the whole, has relatively few UFO reports, at least as interpreted. But what they do have are dozens and dozens of cases of strange lights, which are variously interpreted as witches, or as spirits, or as death warnings.
We had this last night in the Australian context, it's the Min globes.
Yeah.
It sounds very similar, some of them, not all of them. But, yeah. Sorry, I'm hogging the mic.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Okay, that's Sam, right at the back.
Just curious about the bodies, the non-decaying bodies, that kind of thing. You touched upon plants, the different attributes that the natives know about and we don't. Do you think that there's possibly some kind of fungus or preservative oil of some kind, a bit like poison oak, since the once it's on your clothes, you can't get it off, even 10 years later, you dig your clothes out again, but it's still got that oil on it. Do you think there's some kind of fungus that's just taken over these bodies, and it's when the bodies are in the soils or in the catacombs, in and out, wherever, it's just remaining there, this fungus of some kind of oil? Do you think it could be that?
It's possible. I mean, you know, one pays your money and takes your choice, as Barry Norman used to say on Film 80, whatever it was. It's all up for grabs as to possible theories. Whatever it is, it started happening since 1959, because it didn't happen there before, as far as we can establish. So it is a modern mystery. There could be, you know, all kinds of explanations, and that could be certainly one fruitful line of inquiry. The ideas are just mushroom as to possible explanations.
Guys, I'm sorry once again. I apologise for all our previous speakers, but I'm really sorry to have to sort of truncate this, because I'm sure that the conversation with you guys could have gone on all evening. But we have something far more important than 40 hours in Colombia in a minute. We have the cake eating competition for kids. So, without anything else, Alan, my dear, I hope you come back and see us again very soon, because it's a privilege having you. Alan Murdie, thank you very much.